Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and I am here with my main man in mobile, Benedict Evans. Can I say that out loud?
You can say anything you want.
Benedict, welcome. You did an interesting blog post recently about how, at a high level, like all the questions we've been, asking and trying to answer over the last 5 to 7 years aren't the questions you want to ask or answer anymore. So Give us a little bit of an overview of why you want a new set of questions for mobile.
Well, I think so. There's two parts to this: there's the old questions and the new questions. And the old questions are things like what's going to happen to BlackBerry, what's going to happen to Windows Phone, what's going to happen to Nokia.
What is going to happen to BlackBerry?
Well, I don't care anymore. It's an interesting question for BlackBerry shareholders, but they're not really relevant as part of the market.
Right.
But the point is, all those kind of platform or questions are done. And we now know that Apple is selling the top 10% of all the phones on Earth, and that's growing steadily. And Android takes the next 50% of all the phones sold on Earth, and that's growing slightly faster.
Top 10% by price?
Of volume.
Of volume,
Of
okay.
all the actual phones. And yet we also know that because Apple is, for a bunch of reasons, including the price and the operating dynamics of their business, they have a very large proportion of the customers that any developer or publisher actually wants. And so they had 80% of all the e-commerce revenue on the Black Friday spending festival in the US, and about half of global web browsing, depending on which numbers you believe. And it could be a third, could be 2/3, depending. But they have a disproportionately large share of actual usage and value compared to the number of units they have. And so Apple's position seems to be fairly stable. Developers aren't going anywhere. Users aren't going anywhere. And Google's position is also very stable. That they've kind of got. But so they both won and they both got what they wanted. And we've discussed all of this to death over the last year, 2 years, 3 years. And actually, we kind of know what the answers are. And that's not really very interesting anymore. And actually, there's a whole bunch of newer questions about what's going to happen next that are actually more interesting and more fruitful to discuss. And so I kind of broke these down in a kind of a sequence. And I think when we can kind of pick them apart one after another, the first one is what happens to Android OEMs, Android handset manufacturers, where that situation is now very unstable. And the second question that follows on from that is what is Android itself going to be? Both what are those OEMs going to do? Is open Android going to be meaningful outside of China? And what's Google going to do with Android? And that in turn flows into, well, what is the interaction model going to look like? Because clearly that changes if the operating system changes. And then you have kind of other questions like, well, what are Facebook and Amazon going to try and do? What's going to happen with wearables? And what changes fundamentally as a result of the scale of the whole industry? And so all of those things are kind of areas in which major things can change in the experience and the dynamics of mobile. Whereas arguing about, Windows Phone or iOS versus Android is just kind of pointless, really.
So you expect major changes, but again, not in the sort of way that we've become accustomed to seeing them.
So, if we go through those sort of one at a time, there's been a question for 2 or 3 years as to what was going to happen with Samsung, which had taken half of the Android market by volume and almost all the profits, and yet hadn't really produced kind of clearly differentiated products and hadn't managed to produce any kind of ecosystem value on top of that.
Right.
And we've now seen in the last 3 or 4 quarters that Samsung's revenue is starting to sag quite badly, and particularly that their sales of high-end handsets are sagging very fast. And the problem that they face is not so much resurgence of the companies we've all heard of, but just a kind of a flood of smaller companies that are riding on the whole Shenzhen ecosystem and using the whole Shenzhen ecosystem for scale. And so the question is, well, what comes next? Do Xiaomi manage to go global? Do other Chinese vendors manage to go global? Is it local players? Do we get new players emerging? Is there a new global player that's going to emerge? Is anyone going to be able to take on Android at the high end? All of those things just kind of turn over and over because we don't know what the vendor landscape is going to look like. It's sort of like we're having the PC industry, but compressed into 5 years instead of 20 years.
Right.
All the same sorts of issues are coming up.
Has Samsung's experience sort of taught the Chinese, manufacturers something? It seems like, is the Android business not a great one to be in?
Well, Android business of itself is a bad business unless you embrace being a commodity box shifter. And there's a business to be had there. It's not a great business, but there is a business to be had there.
Right.
I think you see 2 or 3 things that are different from the Chinese vendors. One of them is simply that they're trying to go international now, which they've never really done before. The second is that they are embracing design and brand and marketing in a way that the Korean manufacturers have always struggled to do. And so there are 3 or 4 Chinese manufacturers who are producing handsets that are much more of a level of what HTC or Nokia were doing in terms of design and the kind of the skin on the interface, rather than anything that Samsung or LG is producing. And it's kind of interesting that they will kind of
and so will we
themselves and
start
design.
to see these in the market?
Well, we're starting to, yes. Xiaomi is starting to go international, but only to middle-income markets, only to India and Brazil and places like that, not to developed markets. Much harder for them to come to the USA. But I think the deeper point is it's not so much the individual people who are doing this. It's the broader thing was, the question was always, how do you compete with Samsung's scale? And the answer is, well, maybe you don't need Samsung's scale. Maybe you can use the scale of the whole Shenzhen manufacturing ecosystem, and that's kind of enough, at least up to a point. You reach a certain point that you kind of have to have global sales and distribution and so on. But if you're doing 5 or 10 million units a quarter, maybe you don't need to have what Samsung's built and what Nokia had built before that. I mean, that kind of leads on to the next question, which is, well, if you're not a shareholder in one of these companies, why does it matter who it is that's selling Android phones, particularly if they're all a commodity anyway?
Right.
And the answer is that it kind of bears on what it is that Android becomes, because on one hand, you have Xiaomi trying to build, or let me put that differently. Xiaomi is the first Android manufacturer that has kind of successfully built a differentiated software experience on top of Android. Obviously, all the manufacturers have sort of tried and not come up with anything that anyone particularly liked. In China, you have this kind of no-fly zone because Google services are absent. And so everyone has to do their own thing anyway.
Right.
And Xiaomi has managed to produce kind of a combination of what you'd get from Google and what you'd get from Apple if you were spending 3 times as much, and produce like a kind of a nice user interface and experience on top of that. And they're now trying to take that global. Now, when they go outside China, they use Google services. But the big question is, given A, no one's making much money from Android anyway, B, it's very hard to differentiate within the constraints that Google sets on you if you use Google's version of Android, closed Android in effect. Do you start seeing more people trying to deploy open Android, that is to say Android without Google's constraints, with trying to build their own set of services on top of that? You've seen Amazon try that and fail mostly, certainly fail in phones, but there's sufficiently many kind of weirdnesses about the Kindle Fire phone that it's probably not a kind of a good test case overall.
And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that HTC or LG or some of these other manufacturers
the problem for them,
forced to do it?
Well, the problem for them is that Google's contract says you're not allowed to sell a forked, an uncompatible, an open version of Android. Or if you do, you can't sell a single phone that has Google services on it.
Huh.
So you can't experiment. But again, this is to my point that you may start seeing new companies emerge that have got nothing to lose, and that may try and kind of create a really clearly differentiated offer on the back of that. Now, there's a whole bunch of, you can then go off and spend an hour talking about the dynamics of Android and why this is hard and which Google services are crucial and which are not. Very briefly, it seems like the Maps and the App Store are crucial. None of the other services matter very much. So then the question is, okay, are we completely sure it's impossible to compete with Google Maps? And where is it impossible to compete with Google Maps? What becomes of Nokia here, for example? Does that become a viable alternative? How many people care enough about maps that the gap is actually meaningful, particularly at lower price points? And does that become an angle for someone to go and carve 5 or 10% out of the German market with a €100 phone that runs Android apps but doesn't use the Google App Store? And what App Store would they use? Would it be the Amazon App Store? So there's this sort of maybe point in this narrative here, which, of course, our portfolio company, Cyanogen, could be a participant in, because it could provide a platform to do that. And then, so the thing that flows out of that whole set of questions, and again, each of these could be an hour-long conversation in their own right, but then the thing that flows out of that question is, okay, well, what do we mean when we say Android? The reason that Android exists is because Google realized that smartphones were not a neutral, transparent platform the way a web browser was.
Right.
And that the platform owner could do stuff and that they could block Google. And so this shows how long ago this was. Google were actually afraid of Microsoft rather than afraid of Apple. And so they created this mobile phone platform. And it's been enormously successful for Google, vast store of wealth for the entire manufacturing industry. But yeah, so that's the earlier conversation. But by the same token, if other people start being able to use and being able to succeed in what Amazon tried to do, then you start changing the interaction model. where you start saying, okay, it's not a 3x4 grid of icons anymore. What other services are integrated? How are those services integrated? What are the means by which you access services? What happens to web pages? What happens to apps? What partnerships? Do you start having more of like an on-deck conversation, like which decks do we need to be on? Which OEMs do we need to do preload deals with? Do preload deals start becoming meaningful again? And the thing that's, I think, sits underneath all of that is the question that it's not entirely clear what Google wants to do with Android in the next 5 years. It is entirely possible, for example, that we could be sitting here using Chrome-based phones in which Android is a sort of legacy runtime. But Google clearly wants to blur the difference between web pages and apps.
So Chrome meaning web-based?
Yes.
Or back to the web?
Yeah, exactly. With Chrome apps that are delivered over the web. And of course, from Google's point of view, that you get kind of a weird set of dynamics here, because at one level within Google, they want everything to be the web because everything is indexable and linkable. And that's, what they do. They can see everything, they can link to everything, they know what everything is, they know how everything works. And if stuff is inside an app, yes, you can sort of deep link to it, but it's you don't get anything like the richness of knowledge that they get from looking at the web. And so they'd like everything to be the web. On the other hand, the way that they retain control over the Android OEMs is with this API layer, which is all about what happens on the handset. And so if you go to a handset where everything's happening inside web views and all the APIs are happening on as API calls on the web, and payments and all that stuff is done through a sort of set of neutral kind of APIs and what have you, then it doesn't matter if you don't. Then the value of Google Play Services, the value of GMS evaporates.
Right. But you
and so then at that point, you kind of wind back and you say, well, then there's no difference between an iPhone and an Android phone because you can access all the apps that you could get on Android. You can get inside Safari on an iPhone. So you get these kind of weird sort of shifting layers upon layers upon layers. I mean, the joke that I used in the so that's just kind of Android.
But you've described the world that we are in already as this post, Netscape, post PageRank world.
Exactly, but it's post Netscape, and post PageRank, but it's also not. We haven't stopped yet. So for 20 years we had this. There's this period in the mid-90s where it was like, is it Gopher? Is it Pointcast? Is it Push? Is it this or it's that? And the answer was no. It's the web browser. And for 20 years, we had this monoculture of the web browser and the mouse and the keyboard, and that was the internet experience. And yes, you had email and Skype and Spotify and a few things around the side, but basically the internet experience was the web browser in a kind of rectangular box on your monitor. And obviously with smartphones, we don't have that anymore, so we're post-Netscape, or perhaps pre-Netscape. And very obviously, as a consequence of that, the PageRank model broke down as well. But my point is, there was this period of kind of swirling uncertainty from like in the mid-90s, and then it settled on the browser. We're in a period of swirling uncertainty now. It's not clear that it's going to settle. Mm-hmm. Because you have a degree of sophistication in a smartphone operating system that you didn't have in the desktop operating system in quite the same way. And the dynamics are very different because you have both Apple and Google kind of pushing very hard to differentiate on the stuff that happens. So, back to the sort of point about for Google, you've got this kind of weird sense of conflict because on the one hand, you want everything to be on the web. On the other hand, you want to control Android with these APIs.
Right. And
you want to kind of push services down. On the one hand, you're kind of pushing services out of the web onto the handset. But on the other hand, you want stuff to be out of the handset onto the web, depending on which tier within Google you're thinking about. And then you have this other strand going on, which is a broader, a non-Android point, which is that you have both, you have all these layers of aggregation. And so you said, okay, is your service hard to find in the App Store? Is it hard to find on the web in Google? Is it hard to find inside Twitter or Facebook? It's kind of which aggregation system are you buried in?
Right, and all those are different aggregations.
Yeah, and then when you go to China, then you have WeChat and Baidu Maps and all sorts of other things which are providing again these new kind of sites of aggregation and discovery and agglomeration and everything else. And so you get this kind of weird cycle where you unbundle web sites out of the web browser into these multiple apps. But these apps themselves are also bundles because, there's just a whole stack of web pages there and you can't get to individual ones. And then you have Facebook or you have deep linking or you have messaging, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then you unbundle stuff back out of those web pages and you bundle back into Facebook or Facebook Messenger or Twitter. And then you have all these notifications flooding out of all 45 different apps on your phone. So then you've got a stream of notifications in the notification panel, and on both iPhone and Android, that's kind of a broken experience just because there's too much stuff in it. So it's like, well, how many different ways can we cycle between aggregated, not aggregated, bundled, unbundled messaging, pages, apps, and back again? all in one cycle. I mean, this is the line I used on my blog post as a quote from a sort of a P.G. Wodehouse novel where someone says that when he catches up with somebody, he's going to shake him till he froths and then pull him inside out and make him swallow himself. And you feel like, what's happening now is apps are kind of being pulled inside out and then swallowing themselves and then being pulled inside out again. And I think messaging is an important kind of part of that, because when you look at the sort of the shift to actionable notifications, with message buttons and payloads and so on inside the notifications, so you don't even have to open the app. And then you look at watches, where a large part of the watch use case is in, whether explicitly or implicitly, it's displaying notifications and messages. Or it's just displaying, very, very small pieces of information with a yes or a no button, even if it's not explicitly presented as a message.
Right.
You get this kind of unbundling characteristic. And then, of course, to the extent that watches take off, that drives back onto the smartphone interaction model. All of which is to say, there's this thing called Zawinski's law that says every program attempts to expand until it can read email. And you're kind of getting that now on smartphones, which is like, okay, every website attempts to expand until you can get people to install an app. And then every app attempts to expand until you can send notifications. And then every notification expands until it becomes an app. And then and then you need Gmail for your notifications. Or you need like a newsfeed aggregator for your notifications. So we've got this kind of spinning, or like a washing cycle.
Right.
Everything goes round and round and round. And as I said, wearables feed into that because they impose this new kind of discipline on what some of your interaction with those things might be.
And are wearables, in the way that they unbundle things, sort of, a chink in the hegemony of Apple and Android? Or, do you see...
I don't know about that. I just think that they just add this other layer of complication. What they also, I think, of course, do is reinforce an app model as opposed to a web model, incidentally. Right. Wearables... I wrote a long blog post about the Apple Watch. I think I have two kind of tools, two lenses through which to look at watches in particular. And one of them is to think of when I saw the first iPad. The thing about the iPod was, if you wanted a very slim, easy-to-use 10-inch tablet to carry everywhere with you, it was clear that this was the right one. And all the ones that had come before were not nearly as good. But it also wasn't clear whether you wanted such a thing at all. And the Apple Watch is kind of the same thing, that, if you want to carry a little color screen on your phone, which you can do certain computery things with, on your wrist that you can do certain computery things with, the Apple Watch is the one, and there'll be others. Maybe the next Motorola 360 will be a bit better, and it won't be the only one. But we kind of got to the point that the things are there if you want them. But the question is, well, why do you want them? They're small enough, and the battery lasts all day. But okay, fine. But do you actually want to do something with that? And then the other lens that occurred to me was to think back to the original mobile phones, because if we'd all been sitting here in 1995 saying, "Do any of us need a mobile phone?" we'd all have said no. Because we've already got telephones. We've got a telephone on our desk, and you've got one at home, and there are these payphones everywhere. So why would you need a mobile phone? And most people actually genuinely felt they would never own a mobile phone. I remember like mid-early 90s, why would I ever need? I'm never going to have a mobile phone. And so, again, you look at watches, and it's quite hard to work out whether they end up like a Segway or a Google Glass,
right,
as this kind of blind alley, or whether this is kind of a new category in the way that tablets or mobile phones themselves became. Then there's kind of another strand within this that, again, kind of flows out of this interaction model question. And also, I think, flows out of the thing that I said earlier, that for Google, let me phrase it slightly differently. Facebook and Amazon's motivation on mobile is very similar to Google's motivation, which is that the web browser was this neutral, transparent platform, and, having Facebook making a web browser or Amazon making a web browser would be a kind of pointless thing to do. And frankly, Chrome on the desktop wasn't, terribly valuable of itself. Mm-hmm. It's when you're signed in on every device and you have Chrome on mobile and you have Google Now and everything else, that's when the browser became important. But even then, I don't think Facebook care what browser you look at. It doesn't make any difference to them if you look at them in Chrome. Whereas on the smartphone is not this neutral, transparent platform you can have now, and you've got native search and you've got widgets and all sorts of other things that change how you might buy things. And that's a problem and change how you might share things. And that's obviously a problem for Facebook, because the smartphone is a social platform in the way that the web browser wasn't. And so It's a thing that's emerged in the last sort of 18 months to 2 years with this explosion of messaging apps and WhatsApp in particular. On the desktop, once you've added all your friends, you don't want to do that again on another site. You don't want to upload your photos again on another site. You don't want to keep checking multiple sites. On a smartphone, every app has your address book, it has your photos, it knows your location, it does push notifications, and so it's very easy to use lots and lots of different apps and switch between them. And this is why Facebook has gone from being the only social network on desktop to being only one of many social networks on mobile. And Amazon has a slightly less immediate problem. But again, if the mobile phone becomes his buying device and it's using the camera and location and everything else, it's much easier. And, most obviously something like Apple Pay, one of the key reasons to buy something on Amazon, particularly on mobile, is it's already set up with your account, so you don't need to enter a credit card in. Well, if you've got Apple Pay, then you don't need that. All of that aggregation goes away. You load the app, you push your finger on the fingerprint scanner, and the app gets your credit card. Although it doesn't get a credit card, it just gets your payment details and your address anyway. And so for both Facebook and Amazon, they have the same problem that Google had. That where do we sit in this? Because we've been shunted off to one icon, which is the web browser icon, or if we're lucky, the Facebook icon, the Amazon icon. How do we move further down the stack? How do we move to that primary aggregation layer?
So that's my question. I mean, Google's response clearly was Android.
Yeah, well, that was the first response, and then there's other responses afterwards.
Right, and Amazon's response has been to sort of,
Well, Amazon and Facebook have had these more or less completely unsuccessful responses at that level. Let's say, obviously, the Facebook app and Messenger and WhatsApp and so on are all hugely successful, but those are all, and the Amazon app is very successful, but those are icons.
Yes.
And what they haven't been able to do is move one level down the stack into the aggregation and the discovery layer of the phone itself. So,
so my question is that necessary kind of as we shift into this next phase?
It's a fundamental strategic requirement. Yep. So, if I pull down on my iPhone screen and start typing, Apple decides what gets suggested to me. Apple decides that it will show me restaurants and iTunes albums and appointments and so on, as well as my appointments and my emails and so on.
Right.
There's no API. It doesn't decide whether it's going to let Amazon do that. Now, in the future, it may, of course. So all of this stuff is kind of changing. But again, Google sticks the Google search bar on the home screen of an Android device. And so if you want to find out about something, how can I put it? You open a web browser, and then you decide whether you're going to go to Google or Amazon. But on a phone, you're in Google to start with.
Right.
And then on an iPhone, again, Apple has these sort of different kind of shifting motivations. Obviously, but Apple is less of a competitor to both Facebook and Amazon than Google is.
So we've seen Amazon's sort of bald-faced, intention.
Yeah, so we had both. So there was very briefly a Facebook phone in sort of pre-smartphone days almost.
Right.
We had Facebook Home, which failed, obviously, and that was kind of an attempt for them to move up the stack, or rather move down the stack. And we've had the Kindle Fire Phone, which has also been a failure for a bunch of reasons. But I'm not sure either of those are kind of definitive at all. And again, this kind of comes back to the conversation earlier about, what is the future for a forked Android? What is the future for Open Android? Does Open Android start working outside China, and how? Can Amazon make its App Store work? Can Facebook start making layers what partnerships would Facebook do with a new handset vendor? What would that look like? What would the experience be on those devices? Would those be more appealing? Who might buy them? What happens if somebody starts selling an Android phone that comes with Facebook Home or some new kind of experience kind of combined? And I suppose the thing for all of these is one can have a half-hour conversation or 1 hour conversation or a 2 hour conversation about the barriers to changing Android and getting Open Android to work outside China. One can have a 1 or 2 hour conversation about apps and web and notifications and messaging. The point is, these are the questions. Yes. The question is, who are the Android vendors going to be and why? And then what's going to happen? Is Open Android going to work or not? What is Google going to do with Android? Where is this kind of shifting barrier between apps and the web and notifications and messaging and sort of, interaction models and, aggregation at different levels of the stack? Where is that going to settle? Because I don't know what the answer is yet. Whereas in 2000, the answer was, it's the web for the next 10 years or the next 5 years. We're not at that stage now where we know how any of that's going to work. And then there's At the same time, though, where we all began this is that, both Google and Apple won. Does the next sort of phase mean that sort of victory is not necessarily, a foregone conclusion? Well, victory is always contingent in this space. I mean, I think how can I put it? Someone kind of complained at me that I was always talking about, problems that Google face, and I'm biased against Google. I'm writing anti-Google blog posts, which is kind of, on one level, it's kind of silly, but there's a point in here which is that the sort of the existential question for Apple is, can you carry on selling $600 phones? How many more of them can you sell? Does the market for $600 phones kind of go away?
Right.
But questions of, you can't argue about Apple's control of iOS. They control it. And kind of internal product questions like, do extensions work well, yes or no, are not really kind of structurally important. They're just kind of product questions. And the same when you then turn to Android, then the question is, well, okay, what is Android even going to be in 5 years' time? Is Google going to control it or not? Is Google going to turn it upside down and make it a Chrome product? Yes or no? Is Xiaomi going to become significant? Is Amazon going to succeed in breaking into making Open Android a viable product in the USA? Those are important questions, and they are not. The answers to those are not settled yet. And so another way of saying this is kind of the question of what Android is kind of matters to the future of mobile. The question of what iOS is doesn't matter in quite the same way.
Right.
It's more like that's kind of a vendor question. And so when you pull that sort of stuff together, as I said, you get this kind of chronic uncertainty. I think the deeper point there is, then there's a sort of a longer term thing, which is, well, how does Oculus change this? How do wearables kind of pull the whole smartphone business inside out? Does something like Magic Leap, which we're an investor in, change this dynamic as well? You could kind of apply a kind of an a priori observation that, ecosystem dynamics, and once people have won, the next stage has to be some fundamental transition. It has to be like a new interface technology or something. And so, for example, people trying to do new smartphone operating systems now remind me quite a lot of B or Next. That is to say, yeah, I've got a BCD somewhere. It was a great product. It was not actually going to work.
Right.
And Next, again, in hindsight, that was just not going to work. It was just the wrong time to try and do a new PC platform. And, it was just sort of luck, obviously, that Apple ended up kind of needing Next. And so, but that wasn't the game plan. The game plan was not get bought by Apple. The game plan was create a new platform. And it was too late. And I think the same thing applies to Firefox OS or Jola or I've even forgotten what the Samsung one is even called. Tizen, exactly. It's not going to work. That's not where the change comes from. The change either comes from, well, what does Android even mean? Or it may come from some fundamental shift in the interaction technology, either new hardware, which is what multi-touch did for the iPhone, potentially some sort of fundamental long-term shift away from apps to web, which would change the way the operating system dynamics works. I think that's a bit less likely. But other than that, we're set. It's just we don't know what the victory is going to look like. Well, there's a sort of famous kind of historian's quote that history teaches us nothing except that something is going to happen. And I'm sort of exasperated by people who think that looking at Windows versus Mac tells you something about this, right? Because both the iPhone business is in a fundamentally different position in the industry to where the Mac position was, but also Android is in a fundamentally different position to where Windows was as well. And trying to compare these things, it really doesn't tell you anything very useful.
Well, one thing that's going to happen, and this is one of the points that you've made in several different ways, is that scale is going to be an engine of this change. And describe that for us.
Yeah. So back in 95, there were about 250 million PCs on Earth. And Apple had probably low double-digit number. I don't actually know what the number was, but they've got 80 million Macs now. So they didn't have very many Macs back then. But there were 250 million PCs on Earth in total. So this is basically before the internet took off. Now there are about 1.6 billion PCs and 80 million Macs, and probably the same again number of Linux. So 1.6 billion includes Macs. And there's 2 billion smartphones, 2 billion iOS and Android phones, and of which about probably 500 are iPhones. And we'll go to 4 billion. There's about 3.5 to 4 billion people on Earth today who have a mobile phone. There's a lot more SIM cards, but there's 3.5 to 4 billion people on Earth today who have a mobile phone. And that will grow to about 4.5, of which about 4 will get smartphones, maybe a bit more, bit less. And the variable there is who has an affordable data plan rather than, and who has because you'll get a lot of kind of grey areas around the edges that you've got a smartphone but you don't have a data connection or something. So there'll be 4 billion smartphones, and that encompasses everything from people in America buying an $800 phone every year to farmers in Burma who built their house themselves out of reeds and mud, who have a third-hand $50 Android phone from China with no name on it,
right,
that's running a 3-year-old version of the operating system, and they never connect to cellular data, but they go to Wi-Fi once a week when they go into town. And those will all be smartphone customers, which is, among other things, points to the fallacy of looking at unit market share on a global basis and thinking this tells you something about what you should be developing for.
Right.
So you have to think about, well, who are these people? But we get, as it might be, 4 billion smartphones on Earth. But then you have to multiply those because they are mobile, they're not stuck in an office or in a room somewhere, and they're personal, they're not shared with your family or your colleagues or something. And they have all of these sensors on them, and they have built-in payment, and they have a camera and location, and they're an order of magnitude easier to use, and fundamentally they're in your pocket all the time. And so the actual opportunity isn't just that there's 2 or 3 or 4 times more devices. It's more like a kind of a 10 times increase in the opportunity set. And that's one of the reasons that everyone in Silicon Valley is so excited or overexcited about mobile sometimes, because you think, well, hang on a second, we're going to a much, much bigger group of people. One of the things that I think is I keep kind of pushing away new analogies or new ways of explaining this, is that we're connecting everybody for the first time. And it's hard quite to express what you mean when you say everybody. One of the charts in the presentation that I've been giving shows the number of people who are not connected. And so we all see these charts that go up and to the right. But the problem with those charts is they don't really show you what the top is. What's actually happening is that there are 5 billion adults on Earth, and 4 to 4.5 billion of them will be online. And basically the only people who are not online are the people who are not economically active or who are basically being shot at. People who are really, really at the margins of society.
Right.
But even in Kenya or South Africa or Myanmar or, impoverished parts of India or Indonesia and so on, huge numbers of people have mobile phones. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the population is under cellular coverage, and most of that will get 3G in the next 5 years. And 40% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa has a cellular phone today. So there was this whole argument. People kind of criticize me for being a kind of Silicon Valley utopian visionary, which I know the GPs here would find hysterically funny because I'm generally the guy in the room who says, this isn't ever going to work. But outside the Valley, I count for kind of a utopian visionary because I say things like, well, everyone's going to have one of these things. But what people almost don't realize is the mobile industry had that argument 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people were saying, well, nobody in India is ever going to get a phone, or, only like 1% of the population will get a phone. No one in Kenya is ever going to have a mobile phone. There'll be 5 people in Nairobi who have a mobile phone, and that will be it. And it turns out, no. Everybody is going to have one of these things. And actually, the poorer you get, the more valuable they are. If you are if you're a bricklayer in a third-tier Indian city, your $10 Nokia has doubled your income because you find out where the jobs are.
Right, you know where the work is.
You know where the work is, or if you're a fisherman, you're a farmer, or anything else. And again, these sound like kind of silly utopian ideas, and 10 years ago people were claiming they were. Well, we had that argument, and they've all got phones now. And they all decided, actually, I do need to stop smoking cigarettes, or, buy less clothes, or walk to work instead of taking the bus to get a phone. And that's now what's happening with smartphones, and what's happening with the internet. And that, I think, is the sort of the scale driver that sits across all of this. The PC industry is so much smaller than the mobile industry ever was, and the PC internet is so much smaller than the mobile internet.
What I'm fascinated by, and we've seen, like you said, Apple and Google got what they want, but what we will start to see is all these things built on top of all that connectivity, all that scale, and things that may not be great businesses for Apple or Google or Amazon or Facebook, but they sure are going to be great businesses for somebody.
I think that's right. I mean, the other thing that strikes me when you look at that kind of global scale is that if you think back to the PC business, it was basically the USA and a couple of other developed markets, and so the PC market was the market. And you made a piece of software, and maybe you had to open a sales office in London or Tokyo or something, but basically there was one market, and the dynamics were kind of the same in the market across all of them, and so the network effects and the ecosystem effects and so on were the same across everywhere. Today, if you ask Target or Chase Manhattan, are you going to stop doing an iPhone app because Apple has only 20% share of the smartphone market and Android has got 80% share? What you're actually saying is 45% of your users have got iPhones, and probably 2/3 of the value of your users have got iPhones. But there's 500 million Android users in China. And they say, so what? And then turn that the other way around. If you're an entrepreneur in Jakarta or Mumbai, there's a very, very small number of very rich people in your country who have iPhones. But all the middle class have got Androids.
Exactly.
And so you don't care at all what people are doing in San Francisco or Tokyo. And so you start getting specific or local ecosystems in much the same way that you get in any kind of mature global industry. It's almost like, what was the analogy I was thinking? It's a little bit like retail, which is like a terrible analogy. But, again, like if you're running a supermarket in Germany, you're not scared of Walmart.
Right.
You don't care at all.
No,
but what's about? I think Walmart actually have a business in Germany. If you're running a supermarket in Brazil or in Indonesia or in whatever, you don't care very much about what Tesco is doing or what Best Buy is doing. You might read about it in The Economist, but other than that, you actually have your own market. And yes, it's an imperfect analogy because an internet company can sort of theoretically can compete anywhere, but in practice, you can't really.
Right.
You kind of got to be local. And so part of the maturing of the tech industry is that you actually go from saying, well, there's this many people using Facebook, there's this many people using iPhone, so that's what we go for. So no. What's your target market? Because your target market is not the global market share anymore. Your target market is people in Spain.
Right. It's going to be fascinating. And we will dig into these questions more at a future date. So, Benedict, thank you so much.
Thank you.